Sanjay, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And afternoon, everybody. Um, Few of you know me very well. One or two I'm meeting first time, and one or two old friends I hadn't talked to for a while. So I'm glad to see they've joined us. People like Andrew Paris as well. So yes, I've been on this journey over 35 years, and still learning. And I think the day we think that we know it all, it's a downward slide. I started over 35 years as a lean manager in industry for Royal Daltons, and then moved on in consultancy, academia, back out. And 19 years I did in the public sector as one of those senior civil servants that we could be referred to as. And for the last 14 months, back into full-time academia. And like Peter says, I think one of the joys is doing the research, finding out a bit more, seeing where the gaps are, and seeing how we can plug that. I'm predominantly, as a program director at Buckingham, looking after the professional doctorate program, and that's the only reason I jumped ship. So they're senior practitioners, people like Meg, who very bright cookies, huge experience, but now want to convert that into a doctorate as well. So we tend to only take people with that kind of calibre who've got a lot of relevant experience and then want to get a professional doctorate, which is equivalent to a DBA, for want of a better phrase in kind of American terminology. So when Stuart approached me, it was quite coincidental in that respect, because last year I spent quite a bit of time looking at critical success factors, and the work that Anna and Peter did, I thought was totally resonated with me. Mine came from different angles, some of the minutiae. In other words, why are companies continuing to make these mistakes about which matrix and designing the appropriate matrix to look at sustaining their CI and lean journeys? So a small slide deck, I'm happy to share that with all of you. I'm sure Stuart will, and we'll start with that. And sometimes it's important, if we go on to the next slide, sometimes it's important to look at the kind of the basics and how we build on that. So if we go on to slide 2, I've offered you a definition. I must have come across hundreds of definitions of what is CI. And I must say, one that resonates with me simply is Bouillon and Bagwell's. Although now it's 20 years old, I think it's still much more relevant now than ever before. Straight away, the first two words, it's a culture. So we should never see CI as a process, as a project. It is a culture of sustained improvement. And the way we do that, we target the wastes that appear in most organizations, both the systems and processes. And that in itself, if we sustain that, ironically, what Anna is looking at, is what we refer to as continuous improvement. Now, I don't think the charity sector is any different to the public sector. There were two main overriding aspects that we're enduring. One is shrinking budgets, surprise, surprise. And I got tired in the last 5 years with the CEO, Ministry of Justice is where I worked, always saying to me, Sanjay, we need to do more with less. And those three words, unfortunately, used to sometimes keep me awake at night as well, because you get involved with a huge project and you think, now, where could we make some streamlined savings there? So I doubt it very much that the charity sector is not enduring those same issues. So I think, as Peter rightly says, there's lessons that from the public sector are very easily transferable to the charity sector. So if we now move on to the next slide, I think some of you, I'd be very surprised, are not familiar with this, but I thought it'd be really interesting. And I'm amazed when I still go into companies and we continue to make these basic mistakes. So above the waterline, we will see how organizations look after their CI journeys. We'll see how they do the process reviews. We will see their methodologies, how they do the problem solving. It's quite evident visibly to see the workplace organization, even in this day and age when we're talking about blended working systems. So we'll, in essence, see the technology, tools, and techniques. What we don't evidently see quickly is how well those individual strategies or HR strategy, CI, marketing strategy links into the organization's vision and mission over the next 3 to 5 years. That's not always very clear. We don't often see the leadership traits, the behaviors, the mindsets that exist. So that level of behavioral and engagement. And as Peter said, we're probably from an environment that we now refer to as pracademics. So in essence, we're using the practitioner and the academic experience. How can we enhance this area? And what the research tells us is that below the line that actually can come to harm you. And when we're talking about sustaining initiatives, unfortunately, if those things aren't aligned, then not surprisingly, what we get is after 2 to 3 years in a medium-sized organization, what I refer to as backsliding. So in other words, the momentum, the maturity levels of CI starts to diminish. So now if we go on to the next slide, and what I've tried to do, bearing in mind the audience here, I've tried to kind of capture summary of what the practitioner and academic research is telling us. So what are the fundamental principles of continuous improvement? I was on a call yesterday, I won't mention that organization, it's a top 100 organization, who were professing to me they're taking CI very seriously, yet failed to tell me which CI principles that they were following. So there's a bit of ignorance still about, well, if we look at the workings originally from the likes of Taiichi Ohno, the Ishikawas that we've looked at, Professor Kano, so to the modern age. So I've kind of summarized as 7 principles of continuous improvement. Now, whether it be the charity sector, whether it be manufacturing, logistics, it really doesn't matter. Now, depending which book, which journal you pick up, sometimes there may be 3 or 4. Sometimes they subdivide each one of these and you'll get 20 principles. But for me, I think it rests quite easily on these kind of 7 principles. One is customer focus, guys, or in your cases, we're talking service user. So unless we are doing things that are going to add value to our service users, then there's already a mismatch. Secondly, the employee involvement. So a CI journey generally will only be sustained when there's more people in the organization on board with that journey. So key factor still happens, employee involvement. Now, this isn't a right or wrong. Some organizations will succeed with these kind of big bang, big changes. However, the overriding evidence tells us what works are these incremental improvements, learning from that, embedding the right behaviors, and then moving on. A very important one, particularly in hierarchical organizations, and I found that particularly in the public sector, guys, it has to be a data-driven decision-making. We often, unfortunately, get hijacked by directors, by CEOs, thinking there's a problem somewhere, allocate huge amounts of resources. By the way, we don't measure a lot of these resources often. We're talking people's time, and there's an opportunity cost. If my team spent 4 months because it was on the whim of a deputy director, actually that wasn't an issue, the root cause was something else, that's 4 months of sheer waste as far as I'm concerned. So we should be looking at things which are data driven, and really embracing AI now, there is absolutely no excuse. The cost of gaining reliable data has actually diminished now. So there's no excuse we should not be making decisions which are data-driven. Level of standardization. So in other words, even in a small organization, we should be doing things that are documented and standardized, not to the degree that they become a straitjacket, but to the degree that it helps quality, improvement, training. An extreme example is McDonald's. Whether I have a burger from McDonald's in Newcastle or whether I have it in Budapest, actually the quality, the service should be similar. So that level of standardization has a lot or many benefits it offers. That notion of process orientation, and I was talking with Peter and I was talking with Stuart before many of you joined. I'm now in the middle of a global research with 6 other kind of CI leads across different continents. And we're looking at the old Deming approach, whereby don't blame the operative, because the chances are if something is being produced wrongly, the chances are by 96% of the cause is nothing to do with the operative. It's the systems that are wrong, the training that was undertaken wrong, the equipment given to the operative that was inaccurate, etc. So this notion of process orientation is very important. And of course, a key principle is always waste elimination. A very important piece of work recently published by Durham Business School shows that most public sector organizations, actually, guys, work at between 40 to 48% efficiency. That should tell you something straight away. Look at the NHS, for instance. I remember being at conferences 4 years ago, and if we mention anything about the NHS not being efficient, you were kind of, boo, you can't say that. Now I'm openly seeing discussions, well, yeah, NHS needs more money. Yes, but the NHS itself internally could be more efficient as well, and needs to sometimes look at its own processes and not keep asking for taxpayers' money. That's what we mean by waste elimination. Very important for organizations to do that themselves. So if we kind of move on to the next slide, guys, and this again, what I like about these kind of research is they give you a benchmark. So if we are serious about CI in an organization, I would say then firstly, you should do a diagnostic and think, well, the organizations, practitioner research, academic research is telling us these are the aptitudes that should be in place. Now, there are 11 aptitudes here on a Pareto, on a ranking. I could have listed 40, 50. The main 11 aptitudes. So in other words, is your organization, top leadership, totally committed to sustainable commitment? It's a key question. Another, is the CI journey linked to the overarching 3-5 year strategic plans? Otherwise, there'll always be a mismatch between where CI wants to go and where the organization wants to go. And trust me, I saw it in my old organization. I'm still seeing it within Ministry of Justice. Bearing in mind, Ministry of Justice, you're talking 80,000 employees. That tells you something straight away. If we did the sums about budgets, etc., that there are some own goals we were scoring there. Organizations that do well on CI journey demonstrate employee engagement and empowerment. So in other words, our power isn't just restricted to a few. It actually endeavors to do the best it can by empowering culture in that respect. You're always looking at creating value. So in your case, service users. There's often a structured program of reward and recognition. Very important. Then, not surprisingly, of course, none of us, even charities, have to be self-sufficient. So the effectiveness, efficiency has to be in place. The level of communications. Now, when I talk about communications, sometimes we're quite flippant into, we know there should be good communications. But these organizations that are successfully embedding CI are demonstrating the communication is bespoke, it's customized, it's on a needs basis, different modes of communication, different techniques of communication. So it's in other words communicating like never before. Very important in that respect. And then those feedback loops. That's in other words, has that communication been received by the recipients in a manner that you portrayed it? That's what we mean about appropriate communications, really. Organization learning, the whole notion of knowledge management in essence, really. I in my research in organizations, one of the common things, with Sanjay, we've got a kind of lessons learned. We do lessons learned very well, and then you find out actually you don't do it very well. It's documented very well, but you're not cascading those lessons to the number of people there should be. And how come within your own organization in the Northwest, I've noticed a problem. You're saying you had a lessons learned log. How come 6 months later, Southeast are making the same mistakes the Northwest have made? You're part of the same organization. So that organization learning needs to be much more transparent and much more accessible to become knowledge management in that respect, really. The old Hoshin Kanri, guys, that strategic planning and deployment is very important. Again, with evidence-based decision making. These modern organizations are doing well on CI. Take well-being seriously. Now, and I know during the epidemic and since then, it's kind of raised its profile. There is still a lot of room for improvement there. So we're talking about not just people's physical, but we're talking about mental well-being as well. And when we're getting that right, not surprisingly, those organizations start showing a better. And in each one of those, guys, if you needed more, I've given you references of particular key authors in that area as well. And OPEX CI, guys, demands innovation. Just to keep saying that you're going to rely on your old products, old services, old markets is not enough anymore. We need to be innovative. You need to have a culture of being innovative. I get a classic feedback from companies when I go in, and people there's barriers come up about change, and people, oh, Sanjay, yeah, I know what you're saying, but I've got 30 years of experience in this. And once I get to know them, I tend to then ask a very simple question. Is it really 30 years of experience, or have you got one by 30 years of time experience? So have you been doing the same thing for 30 years, or have you been learning over the 30 years? Sometimes you have to be quite clinical. You have to point out these areas for organizations to almost steer them towards making improvements, guys. So if we kind of now go on to the next slide, and I'll talk about culture. Now, we would be here, guys, for 2 days talking about culture. So it's very important to just, what are the important components of culture for CI? Again, all of you would be able to, if we had time, I'm sure you'd be able to define what your understanding of culture is. I've kind of paraphrased what, for me, culture is. It's, in essence, some of all the things. It's what your company's DNA, what it's made of, what you do to kind of meet your customers' needs, partners, and team members. So, again, it was important to look at those organizations that have done well on their CI journey. Well, which traits of culture were evident there? Most of these, I'm sure if I'd blanked the screen, most of you would have come up with these. But what is ironic is we don't seem to be heeding that knowledge, though. Companies still keep making the same mistake. So, not surprisingly, this sense of belonging. We used to have this old attitude, didn't we? Like, check your personal feelings at the door. Well, I think now companies are recognizing that for employees to succeed, they must be able to bring their whole selves to work. Not surprisingly, well-being, I won't mention any more. Companies demonstrating inclusivity, those companies that do well on CI. So everybody made feel welcome. Everybody's thinking, thoughts, ideas are given enough sufficient equal credibility. That notion of connectedness, so in other words, encouraging teamwork. These organizations that do well demonstrated teamwork a lot better rather than that kind of functional working. There is nothing worse than secrets, gossips, exclusion, really are toxic workplace environments. So that level of transparency is very important. That notion of respect for others, trusting others. So in other words, this kind of, we always hear about no blame culture. I've yet to come across many companies that have a no blame culture. But we all profess that, we operate in this no blame culture. Very important to have that trust there. There should always be this kind of striving towards, there must be a better way of doing something. That again is where that culture gets embedded in that respect. And lastly, not surprisingly, linked to standardization. This level of consistency is very important, really. And leaders need to walk the walk, as I'm putting there, and champion the culture. We'll talk about people who have additional learning needs, whether it be race also, whether it be gender. But actually, sometimes as leaders, we need to really recognize, well, what are the barriers these individuals are encountering? What can I, as a leader, do to eradicate, cancel those barriers? Only then am I going to get the best from that individual. And in fact, by getting the best from that individual, the organization's capability, productivity, capacity is going to improve as well. So those are culture. It's a real minefield, guys, and I tend to digress too much. I'm being quite today trying to be methodical, staying on. But culture is a big. Just to give you an indication that most organizations, and the research tells us, even for a medium-sized organization, it can take you a generation to change the culture of the organization. This isn't done overnight. So you need to persevere. You need to make sure you're embedding the right behaviors, the right traits, and mindset. Very important. So as we kind of move on to the next slide, guys, is I then have taken all those aspects, looked at what the research tells us, and there was a trend a few years ago that we got bogged down into certain styles of leadership are more conducive to CI. Very small causality now. There is an element, and there's particular 4 types of leadership that usually come out. One, for instance, is very much the transformational leadership. So in other words, sometimes those leaders that have a very good OD, HR background can help CI journeys. Then there is an element which goes totally the other end, transactional leadership. Very much goes to the old Douglas McGregor X and Y, inherently saying, actually, most humans are lazy by definition. So there has to be a carrot there, and the carrot is you turn up to work, do a good, and I'll kind of compensate you for that. Element of that, a small element, still true there. There's an element about servant leadership. So in other words, as a leader, I should really be more concerned about if Dee, you came to me, Vicky, you came to me, and you were hitting particular problems with stakeholders. My role then as a leader would be to break down those barriers. So really, I'm not looking after my performance. If I can improve your performance by helping you, then the organization is going to benefit anyway. That's the kind of servant leadership. There's an element there that helps CI, and there's situational leadership that, you know, depending on different situations, you may need to depict different leadership styles. Now, bringing it to the current is actually irrespective leadership style, there are certain things should be in place if your leaders are serious about CI. Not surprisingly, excellent role modeling, good commitment. This vision to true north is, we know the dynamic nature of organizations today. You may take you off course slightly. Do you have the perseverance? Do you have the energy to get you back on course? That's what we mean by this vision towards a true north. Are you prepared to empower employees? In other words, you know, those traits are there. Culture of trust, demonstrating respect again, coaching and teamwork, target setting. Now, that might have surprised you a bit. But bear in mind, and I'm sure Peter would reinforce this, if you look at the philosophy where Toyota, who were kind of, you know, the pioneers of lean, and in fact operated lean for 50 years without giving it a naming convention, by the way. It was only John Krafchick, 87 paper in Massachusetts Institute of Technology, used the term lean. Toyota sat back and thinking, oh, okay, you can name it lean. We've been operating this for 50 years. We don't need to give it a tag as such, really. However, Toyota have effective target setting. And having done some odd bits of work at Bundeston, a factory outside Derby, trust me, you know, this notion about they will compensate you very well, but it's almost as though they expect the productivity to be there as well. Then those information sharing arrangements, not surprisingly, management by facts and only frightened to celebrate success, which we don't see evidently. Now, so if we've now got those leadership, cultural knowledge, how can we apply that to performance management and kind of the paper and work done by Anna? So now if we move on to the next slide, the issue starts to happen is there is a degree, both confusion and secondly, actually misalignment between the way organizations set themselves up to measure performance and what CI is expecting. And why is that? That's because some of the old traditional accounting methods aren't conducive to CI. But we have to do them for legal requirements. Often very little information, root cause analyses. We don't dig deep enough. There are very loose links between financial and non-financial. So in other words, if I'm in an organization and I manage to improve the perception of that organization for the Gen Z, how do I capture that? So there are ways we can capture it, but because it can be a bit difficult, organizations will kind of sway away from that. We still don't pay enough attention to the cross-functional processes. We're very much aligned to our own. I have seen, as late as last week, I was in an organization who were operating a balanced scorecard, but the matrix, almost one department's matrix, whilst they're performing well, actually detrimentally affecting the next department. And they hadn't even bothered to align those performance measures. Very important. We see organizations using too many measures, and I'll come back to that in a way. And how do we aggregate what we are doing in our own small department? How does that impact the overarching organization? We still have a very poor record of looking at that causality. So those are the issues that we're finding. So now if we go on to the next slide, the ideas leave some time for discussion as well. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but that gives you an indication, guys, of the different performance measurement systems that exist. And this is just in the UK. You know, if I was to go Europe, Dimonescu was one of the first ones who looked at how lean can lead to improvements. Most of you will be familiar with Shingo Prize, operated by the University of Utah. Balanced scorecard from Harvard and Kaplan and Norton works, all the way to European Foundation of Quality. Many organizations are utilizing that as a measurement. Then we'll use success diamond. We use objectives by key results. We could spend about 3 hours on each one of these, but that's just to give you an indication of the different performance measurement systems. So what I wanted to do was look at the minutiae, look through this, and look at when organizations are designing the matrix, what mistakes are organizations still making? And if we now go on to the next slide, it then led to, I thought, I'm not getting to the bottom of this. So I did my own research, a paper that was published last year. Happy to share that with you guys. Very well received by the International Journal of Business Performance and Management. So I'm going to share some of the findings, and I'm talking here. It was a sample of 68 companies, guys, across sectors. So it isn't a, 2 companies, and I've made some deductions. But these companies, nearly half of the matrix that they had within their organization actually were not being used. So straight question, why the hell have you still got those utilized? Nearly 4 out of 10 matrix were definitely never used. 2 out of 10 matrix, companies said, we know the advantage, we'd like to, but weren't being used. And only 40% of the matrix of these organizations themselves said, well, the matrix we got are reasonably useful. That led me to do another piece of work, and that's a part that I think added value for the academic community, and I'll say a bit more. But interesting, there were 2 matrix: customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, deemed the most important. I think they are. I'm sure most of you will agree, but were often the least used matrix. Doesn't that tell you something straight away in this spectrum organization? So now if we go on to the next slide, and to enhance that further, I then had to give almost an indication. Well, okay, guys, if you're going to design a matrix, indice, whichever way we want to look at it, performance measure, whichever way we want to look at it, maybe you should take on board these factors. 1, the matrix you've designed, does it have a strategic importance? Or is it just in your little section? Actually, even if you get 100% on that, what impact is it going to make on the organization? Secondly, does it recognize the things you're not doing very well? It should do. Bear in mind the qualitative and the quantitative. So don't forget, perception, culture, goodwill are very important. Don't undersell the benefits of those. Vanity versus actionable, I call them. I call them vanity matrix. And, the number of times these organizations are, oh, Sanjay, we got 95 out of 100. Oh, brilliant. So what were the consequences if you only got 20? Well, not really. Well, that's a vanity matrix then, isn't it? Exploratory versus reporting. So in other words, is a matrix actually leading you to something else to make improvements? That's important. A classic is leading and lagging indicators. Let me give you a very simple, I'll give you an example there, but very simply, most organizations, guys, will have staff perception surveys, don't they? You probably once a year. Well, if your employees keep telling you, I am not happy working for you, I don't like the way management operates, I don't like the way my SPDRs are operated, I'm not being given any training requirements, well, those are leading indicators. What a leader should do is take on board that information. Because if you don't take that information, you will be looking at lagging indicators. It'll be people like Meg putting their notice in and moving to something pastures greener. Well, it's too late then. I've lost a very important key member of the team. Had I listened to Meg's feedback initially, that's what I mean by leading lagging indicators. You'll be surprised how I'm talking top 20 organizations still making these mistakes, guys. Very important. Correlated causals, in other words, do the matrix lead to some improvement? Will it help to make consistency? And then this particular sample of all my organizations were manufacturing, and it was particularly evident that I did see in the service sector. They will be looking at the same thing, but refer it to differently in different parts of the organization. For instance, faults. One part of the organization called it defects. One were calling parts per million. One was calling it scrap rate, and another area was calling it failure rate at inspection. Well, no wonder you're not making improvements, because different people in the same organization have got a different perception about what wastes are. And where you can, reduce the bureaucracy. You do not want to have matrix. So what a system that resonated very well is on the next page, on the next slide. And by the way, I'd love to take all the ownership here. The brilliant work on this was done by Professor Neely, Cambridge, as early as 2005. I've just fine-tuned the model, as you do. Why, reinvent the wheel? So if you've got 20 measures, performance matrix, and you think there's too many, I've come up with a very simple technique. Well, have a look at each matrix. Does it meet your needs? Does it aid your objectives? Can you get accurate measurements? Then, is it financial, non-financial? Does it help causal relationship? Level of stakeholders. Does it help your strategic intent? Is it short, medium, long term? Is it too difficult to measure actually, and by the time you get the information, it's too late? Give it a scoring. Now, I've tried and tested this in an organization. In fact, in this case, I'll mention the company, Dell Computers. So I'm not talking about a little backstreet organization, Dell Computers. And this exercise, their 24 measures took us an hour. Provided you got the right people around the table, 1 hour. For me, guys, that's a very good return on investment. You then getting measures that mean something, that will lead to improvements. Hence the adage, like I said earlier, often less is more when we're talking about performance measures. And it's very important to make sure that your CI journey remains aligned. So now if we go on to the next slide, some key lessons I've kind of, this is a summary of what I've just kind of been saying. And I won't go through them but the third from end, and the reason I'm going to label that is what happens in many good performing organizations, they will have a set of performance measures, their business changes, partners change, employees change, and they're still measuring using the same performance indicator. So don't forget, it also depends on the level of maturity of your organization. So some organizations at the initial stages, reliability might be very important. When you're growing, market growth rates might be important. At the maturity stage, capacity utilization may be important. So that's a subtle measure, subtle hint I'm giving is that the type of measurement it should reflect where you are at your CI journey. Very important in that respect. So now if we go on to the next slide, really, is simply a kind of summary of the role of leadership, guys, the role of culture, why it's so important. Don't get too overemphasized with the styles of leadership, and it's very much about the traits, the mindset, the behaviors, and very important work, including, then I say, people like Meg is looking at. I've got two other students. One is looking at how change is perceived by recipients of the change. Very different angle, very important. Well, I've got a student, the current cohort, also looking at the kind of science, how the brain works. Very useful research. So we've got to bear in mind that this research is moving on, and we need to kind of embrace that and bring that in. So to leave you guys, I would just like to, the last kind of slide there, or the next slide is, we should all look at our own leadership style. None of us are perfect. We like to think we are. We are not, but we all have certain areas we can improve. So very important for your own benefit. You're not doing this for anybody else. Be a good mentor. Very important leaders to be good mentors, guys. And that's got a really high level of causality for a CI journey. Where CI leaders are good mentors, not surprisingly important. Then your own emotional intelligence. Now, as human beings, guys, this does not come easy to us. I can vouch for that. And but it's something we should be doing. So in other words, what do I mean by emotional intelligence? For me, there are 5 components. One, your own self-awareness. How can you focus on yourself, your action, your thoughts, your emotions? And do they align with your own internal standards? That level of self-regulation, how do you manage your energy state, your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors? And I know Meg and I have had some discussions on this when we meet up. Very important, guys, and not easily done. But when you can master that, personally, I think you become a better leader. You become a better individual. I mean, let's forget about even kind of becoming a better leader. You need to be aware of what motivates you, what demotivates you, what can you do to help that. Empathy is very important. So in other words, as individuals, what you are doing, how does that resonate with others around you, with the people that are reporting to you? That empathy is very important. That kind of self-centeredness doesn't exist. And then, of course, that resonates in your own social skills. And so I just wanted to leave you with those things that are very important as your own self-development when we're talking about leadership and your own capabilities, guys. I'll leave it there. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to have any time for discussion at all. Meg knows if I'm left to it, I can ramble on. So it's important to kind of digress there. So I'll kind of open the forum for any questions at all.
Thank you, Sanjay.